I'd always been the one who hosted. Christmas was my ritual, an offering stitched together with cranberry sauce roast folded napkins, and that chipped ceramic angel I always placed near the bread basket. I started preparing the same way I had for decades, by muscle memory. The moment the first cool breeze curled beneath the kitchen door, I pulled out my handwritten recipe cards and unfurled the red linen tablecloth from its careful folds. There was comfort in tradition, or at least there had been, until tradition became a performance where I was both backstage and forgotten. That year, something felt different. Or perhaps not different, just finally noticeable. My fingers ached more than usual while peeling potatoes, and I caught myself reading the recipe for gravy twice, even though I'd made it blindfolded for 30 years. Still, I pressed on. It wasn't the pain that bothered me. It was the sense that the meal might be the only thing still tethering my family to me. If I stopped hosting, what else would bring them back into this house? The kitchen filled with the warm scent of cinnamon and rosemary, but the house stayed cold in other ways. I hung the garland along the banister alone. I set each plate like I always had, but as I bent to place the forks, I saw them through different eyes, like props in a museum exhibit about a woman who used to matter. The voices of my grandchildren, once full of unfiltered joy, were now polite echoes. I couldn't remember the last time any of them came running through my door without being dragged or bribed. When the day finally arrived, I stood at the stove in my soft green cardigan, smoothing my hair back with flour-dusted fingers, and I told myself I was excited, that it would be a good gathering, that maybe this time would feel like old times. They arrived late. Not a disaster, just late enough to stir a twinge of something in my chest. The kind of lateness that says, you weren't a priority. My daughter came in first, air-kissing my cheek like I was someone she bumped into at a networking event. My son-in-law trailed behind her, already on his phone. The grandkids made a beeline for the couch and turned on the television, bypassing me altogether. I offered cookies I'd baked from scratch. No one looked up. I kept smiling, that fixed, familiar smile older women wear like armor. I kept telling myself they're here. That's what matters. I tried to hold on to the flickers of warmth, the little things. A quick, "Thanks, Grandma," from one of the kids. My daughter saying the table looked nice without even glancing at it. But the weight of all the silence in between began to build. Not angry silence, worse indifference. Dinner was called and they shuffled over like patrons at a buffet. I watched them heap food onto their plates, without noticing the garnishes I'd trimmed with shaky hands. I tried to ask how school was going, how work was, if they'd seen that new Christmas market in town. The replies were short, distracted, and always ended with eyes drifting back to their phones, or the television humming softly from the other room. I kept cutting my roast in tiny bites, chewing slowly, swallowing deliberately. Not just the food, but the reality this wasn't a family dinner anymore. It was a courtesy visit. I was the host of a show no one wanted to watch, but felt too guilty to cancel outright. And yet I stayed quiet. I didn't say a word. I played the part. I passed the salt with a smile. I asked if anyone wanted more stuffing. I poured wine for my daughter and laughed at a joke I didn't hear properly. I didn't know if I was being generous or pathetic, but at least for a few hours I wasn't alone. That night when they left, they forgot their container of leftovers on the counter. I stared at it for a long time, steam rising into nothing. And suddenly, I wondered if I stopped doing this, if I didn't host next year, would anyone even notice? The next morning I awoke early, though there was no reason to. The house was already clean, too clean, in fact. Not a single crumb remained on the counters, not a chair out of place. It felt as if the dinner had never happened, as if the entire evening had evaporated overnight, leaving no evidence that people I once called my family had ever sat at that table. I wandered into the dining room and stood by the window. The chairs were still pulled out, just slightly frozen mid-departure. Their absence hung in the air heavier than their presence ever did. I traced my fingers along the wood of the table worn down over the years by Elbow's hot dishes and too many apologies left unsaid. It used to be the heart of this house, where stories were told, laughter erupted from the soul, and love was passed in bowls and glances. But last night, it was just a pit stop, a feeding station before they returned to their real lives. My daughter's husband barely spoke a word to me. He had this way of glancing past me as though I were an echo, not a person. When I asked him whether he liked the roast, he mumbled something about it being a bit dry, and then chuckled, as if he hadn't just struck me where it hurt most. It wasn't the comment. It was the casualness, the way he didn't even look up from his phone as he said it. No eye contact, no awareness, just a flick of cruelty delivered with a smirk. I sat there holding my fork, unsure of what to say, and that's when I saw it, the way the others glanced at me when I hesitated, when I asked someone to pass the butter a second time. They looked at me, the way people look at an old painting in a hallway once admired, now just something you pass without noticing. My daughter smiled too brightly, trying to patch over the awkwardness, but her eyes said it all. I was a fragile thing they were indulging like a child playing pretend. And then it happened again. I asked my son-in-law if he wanted more mashed potatoes, and he leaned over to my daughter and whispered something I couldn't quite hear, but I caught the word senile. His lips curled around it like it was a private joke. She didn't laugh, but she didn't correct him either. She just smiled, that small, tight smile, and kept chewing. My ears burned, not from anger, at least not yet, but from shame. A shame I couldn't explain. I hadn't forgotten anything. I wasn't confused. I was just trying to host a meal, to be of service, to feel needed. But in their eyes, that meant I was old and fumbling, a relic trying to prove its worth in a world that had already moved on. The rest of the meal was a blur of clinking forks and half-hearted conversation. They talked about movies I hadn't seen, apps I didn't use, vacations I hadn't been invited on. I laughed at the right moments, nodded when expected, but the warmth was gone. They weren't really speaking to me. I was just the person who made the food. I tried to remind myself that they had lives, pressures, children, work, that it wasn't personal. But that excuse had become a threadbare coat, unable to keep out the chill. Because the truth was, they were never too busy for each other, only for me. After they left, I sat at the table alone, my plate untouched. I stared at the spot where my son-in-law had sat, where he'd leaned back in his chair and joked at my expense. I'd welcomed him into this family. I'd treated him like a son. I even helped them with the down payment on their first home, and yet to him I was just some fading figure to tolerate once a year. It wasn't until I turned off the lights and stood in the darkened hallway that I realized what hurt most, not what was said, but what wasn't. No one had asked how I was. No one noticed the fresh cardigan I wore, the silver necklace I hadn't put on in years. No one asked if I was happy. I was just a fixture, a host, a servant in her own home. That night I poured myself a small glass of wine, sat by the fireplace, and watched the flames dance. I thought of all the years I'd spent making things easier for them. The loans, the babysitting, the endless acts of quiet sacrifice. And I asked myself, for what? The fire crackled, and for the first time in a long while I didn't feel warm. I was refilling the gravy boat when it happened, one of those small, careless moments that hang in the air longer than they should. The roast was nearly finished, and I was moving around the table like I always had, trying to make sure everyone had what they needed. I asked my son-in-law if he wanted more, since he hadn't touched his plate much. Without even looking up, he said, "She probably already offered me twice. She won't remember, poor thing's getting senile." The way the word rolled off his tongue, it wasn't gentle, it wasn't teasing, it had weight. A smirk came with it, and a low chuckle as if this were a perfectly reasonable thing to say in my home at my table. I froze, hand still gripping the ladle, wondering if I'd heard right. But then my daughter gave that awkward half-laugh like someone trying to downplay a slap. One of the kids giggled too, though I doubt they knew why. And in that moment I wasn't sure which stung more, the insult itself or the casual acceptance of it. I said nothing. I smiled. I set the gravy boat down and went back to my seat. But something in me had shifted. It was a quiet shift, no earthquake, no scream, but it was irreversible. Like a plate that doesn't break, but cracks just enough that you know it'll never quite be whole again. They moved on quickly, talked about movies, joked about traffic, the kids bickered over dessert. No one circled back, no apology, not even an awkward glance in my direction. As if senile were just an ordinary adjective to throw at someone who'd spent her life holding the very ground they stood on. I tried to eat, but my stomach had gone hollow. I picked at my food, nodding here and there, my ears still ringing. The room was the same, the chandelier above the candles flickering the soft hum of a holiday playlist in the background, but it all felt different, distant, like I was watching it through glass. I remembered when he first came into our lives, how eager he'd been to impress, how he'd brought me flowers that first Christmas, complimented my cooking, even helped wash the dishes. I welcomed him like a son, treated him like one, never made him feel like an outsider even when his opinions grated or his humor felt forced. And now here he was making me the butt of the joke, confident that there'd be no consequences. What made it worse was my daughter's silence. She didn't touch my hand, didn't say, "Mom, that's not fair." She just kept chewing, as if ignoring the moment could erase it, as if her loyalty could only stretch in one direction now, and it wasn't toward me. After dessert, I started gathering plates. No one offered to help. My back ached, my feet burned, but I moved slowly and quietly, pretending not to mind. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. If they already saw me as frail, I wouldn't give them a reason to confirm it. In the kitchen, I let the water run too long before starting the dishes. I needed the noise. I needed something louder than my thoughts. Each plate I scrubbed felt heavier than the last. And with each rinse, I tried to wash away the word that had stained the entire night, senile. I wasn't. Not yet. I forgot things, sometimes names of neighbors where I left my keys but who didn't. I was still sharp, still capable, still here. But that didn't matter. What mattered was how they chose to see me. And in that moment, I realized they had already filed me away under irrelevant burden, past tense. I stayed in the kitchen long after they left. My daughter gave me a quick hug, already shrugging into her coat. Her husband didn't even say goodbye. The children barely glanced up from their screens, and then the door clicked shut, and I was alone again with the soft drip of the faucet, the hum of the fridge, and the echo of a word that I would carry like a bruise I couldn't show. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my room turning over everything in my mind. The effort I put in, the love I still held, the way they couldn't even see me anymore. They saw a role, a background character, a box to check off during the holidays, and if they could laugh at me now, what would come next? I wasn't angry, not yet, but I was starting to remember what dignity felt like, and how quietly it begins to rise when you've been pushed far enough. It was never just the word, it was the laughter that followed. That cold, dismissive kind of laughter that people use when they think the person they're mocking won't fight back. That's what stayed with me, not just that night, but long after the dishes were dried and the chairs were tucked in. I kept hearing it, in the stillness of early morning, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the pause between commercials on the television I sometimes left on just to feel less alone. It followed me like a draft under a locked door. The sound of my son-in-law's voice, the tone he used low and smug like a man throwing scraps to a mutt, and then the ripple of amusement that came with it. Like I was something to be tolerated, not cherished. Even the children laughed. Maybe they didn't understand why, but they followed the current of it. They watched how their parents treated me and learned slowly and unconsciously that I was less. That hurt more than anything, the way mockery could be made normal. I tried not to dwell on it. I busied myself with cleaning up the wrapping paper from the gifts they barely acknowledged. I sorted through the clutter left behind a candy wrapper under the couch, a half-drunk cup of cocoa on the windowsill, and one of the kids' socks in the hallway. Little artifacts of a visit that felt more like an intrusion than a reunion, as if they came only because it was expected of them. But the laughter, I couldn't wipe that away. I found myself second-guessing everything I did that night. Had I repeated myself? Did I forget something? Was I really starting to fade in ways I hadn't noticed? I even pulled out my reading glasses and sat down with a crossword puzzle to test myself. I finished it in record time, but that didn't quiet the voice in my head that said, "They think you're broken. They don't see you anymore." I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? My friends were gone, passed on, or moved away. The ones left didn't hear well, or worse, didn't care. I wasn't about to call my daughter and beg for reassurance. I already knew how that conversation would go. She'd say I was being sensitive, that it was just a joke, that I was imagining things. And maybe I would have believed her if it didn't sting so much. There's a difference between teasing and targeting. Teasing comes with affection. This came with the smug assurance that I wouldn't fight back, that I'd smile and clear the plates anyway, that I'd be grateful they showed up. They were right. I'd spent my whole life giving without condition, love without rules, help without hesitation. And now, in the one room that used to be mine, the kitchen, the heart of our family, I was a ghost, my warmth ignored, my labor expected, my dignity eroding one joke at a time. I stood in front of the mirror that night, studying the lines around my mouth, the softness in my eyes. I didn't look senile. I looked tired. I looked alone, but not lost, not yet. There was still something inside me, a pilot light that hadn't gone out, though. The house felt colder by the year. That's when I realized they didn't see me, because I'd stopped asking to be seen. I'd made myself so small in the name of being useful, of being easy, that they'd forgotten I ever took up space at all. And somewhere along the way, I'd started believing that if I kept shrinking, I'd be loved more. But love shouldn't require vanishing. I walked into the dining room one last time before going to bed. The lights were off, but the moon spilled across the table. I ran my hand across the wood again. This table that had held birthday cakes and casseroles, apology letters and handmade valentines. I whispered to it as if it could remember. You were sacred once. We were sacred once. And then I thought about all the things I still owned. Not just objects, but stories, memories, power. I had given so much away. The title of this house, the reins of every holiday, my voice piece by piece. But I was still here, still breathing, still choosing. They may have laughed, but they didn't break me. Not yet. I kept replaying that moment, not just his words, but her silence. My daughter, who once ran to me after nightmares and clutched my neck like I was her whole world. My daughter who used to cry if I left for work without kissing her forehead. The same woman now sat at my table, watched me flinch, and chose to say nothing. I don't know what I expected. A glance, perhaps. A gentle correction. Even a sigh that said, "Don't talk to my mother like that." But there was nothing. Just the clink of silverware and the way her eyes dropped to her plate like it would swallow her whole if she focused hard enough. She didn't defend me. She didn't even acknowledge what was said. It would have been easier if she had joined in. At least then I'd know where she stood. But silence is more dangerous than cruelty. Silence allows the cruelty to settle in the walls. That night, after everyone had left, I stood at the sink with my hands plunged into dishwater that had long gone cold, my fingers shriveled stiff from the ache of age and effort, and I wondered how many times I had done this. Cooked for her, cleaned for her, covered for her. Years of work layered like old wallpaper, one sacrifice pressed over another, until even I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. And yet she said nothing. I sat in my bedroom for a long time holding a small photograph in my lap her first day of school. She had missing teeth and braids I spent half an hour getting even. She looked terrified until I crouched down beside her. I whispered something, probably silly, probably motherly, and in the photo I'm still kneeling beside her holding her backpack, strap anchoring her to the ground. That used to be our rhythm. I lifted her. I steadied her. I gave her everything I had, thinking that if I poured enough love into her, she'd always carry some of it back. But love, when given endlessly without expectation, often teaches people to assume, and she had learned that I would stay quiet when her husband ridiculed me, learned that I would still do Christmas even if I wasn't respected, learned that I would endure anything just to see her smile. But this year she didn't smile. Not really. Her eyes were guarded, her posture stiff. She acted like someone visiting an elderly relative at a hospital, doing her duty but checking the clock every 10 minutes, and yet I still clung to any scrap of affection like a beggar, outside a bakery window desperate for warmth through glass. I thought about calling her the next day, just to talk, to ask why she hadn't stood up for me, but I knew how it would go. She'd say, "Oh, Mom, don't be so sensitive," or worse. "You're overreacting. It was a joke." And those words would be like acid poured onto bruised skin. So instead I said nothing. I sat in my armchair and looked out the window as the snow began to fall. Each flake was delicate, barely there before it vanished, and I felt like one of them, quiet, unnoticed, melting into the background of their lives. But beneath the quiet, something inside me shifted. A slow, low tide pulling back from shore. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. But I began to see what I hadn't let myself see before. That silence wasn't just an accident. It was a choice. And I had been making choices, too. Choices to remain soft when I should have been firm. Choices to stay when I should have stepped back. I watched the snow gather on the railing outside, and I thought of the years I'd lived in this house. The birthdays, the scraped knees, the long nights, rocking babies, who now rolled their eyes at me. I had loved every wall, every creak in the floorboards. I had kept this place alive with my hands and my hope. But maybe it wasn't my home anymore. Maybe it had already been taken from me in small, quiet ways, one eye roll at a time, one unspoken insult, one holiday, filled with strangers who shared my blood, but not my heart. Maybe it was time I made a new choice. The next morning, I pulled the old photo albums down from the highest shelf in the hallway closet, ones I hadn't touched in years. My fingers were stiff from the cold and from sleep that didn't settle right. The spine of the album cracked as I opened it, the plastic covers crinkling like the whisper of a long-forgotten lullaby. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where laughter once spilled over cups of cocoa, and began flipping through my life in glossy still frames. There we were, Christmases past, my daughter in red flannel pajamas beaming beside a lopsided tree. My husband, when he was still kind, carving a turkey with that proud, exaggerated flourish. The kids dancing in their socks across the hardwood, screaming out carols off-key while I pretended to cover my ears. The mess, the noise, the warmth, how it used to fill every room until it felt like the walls themselves were breathing joy. There was one photo I lingered on, me, younger hair, still dark cheeks flushed from the stove's heat, and the firelight beside it. I was holding a tray of cookies, smiling at someone just out of frame. My daughter's tiny hand tugged at the hem of my apron, and my mother's ceramic angel, the one I still placed near the bread, watched over us from the sideboard. The room glowed not because of the lights, but because we wanted to be there. We wanted each other. I closed my eyes and tried to summon the sound of those moments, the squeals of surprise when gifts were opened, the rustle of wrapping paper, the way someone always burned the marshmallows on the sweet potatoes, but we ate them anyway. The way someone always cried during grace, not from sadness, but from the overwhelmingness of love, gathered around one table. When did it stop? It wasn't a single moment, I realized. It faded the way seasons do. One missed visit, one rushed phone call, one holiday shortened because the kids have a lot going on. And I accepted it. I excused it. I told myself that growing up meant growing apart, that this was just life moving forward. But what if I had made it too easy for them to move forward without me? Each year I gave more and asked for less. I didn't want to burden them, didn't want to be the overbearing mother or the clingy grandmother. So I stayed quiet when plans changed last minute. I cooked even when no one offered to bring a dish. I smiled when they gave me generic gifts they barely wrapped, telling myself it was the thought that counted. But the truth is, there wasn't much thought. Not anymore. They didn't see me as someone with needs or longings. They saw me as background, a comforting constant. Like a favorite armchair, always there, always waiting, never demanding. But armchairs get worn. They fray. And one day you find yourself sinking so deep you can't get back up. I looked around the house as it stood now. It was spotless. Too spotless. It used to be filled with clutter and chaos and warmth. Now it felt like a showroom, like I'd scrubbed away even the memories in a desperate attempt to maintain some illusion of grace and composure. But what good was a pristine table if the people around it were hollow? I looked down at my hands, trembling slightly. These hands had iced cupcakes at midnight, had wiped tears, tied shoelaces, packed lunches, and signed checks. They had written letters I never sent, apologies I never owed, and recipes no one asked me to teach. These were not the hands of someone senile. These were the hands of someone seasoned, someone who had carried more than she should have, but did it anyway. My daughter didn't remember those things. My son-in-law never cared. The grandchildren wouldn't even believe half of it. But I remembered, and that was enough. I flipped to the last page of the album, an empty sleeve never filled. I stared at it for a long while. I realized then that I didn't want to put any more pictures in it. Not here. Not in this house. Not if it was going to remain a shrine to the people I used to have. I stood carefully, feeling the familiar twinge in my knee, and carried the album back to the shelf. But I paused before tucking it away. I held it close to my chest and whispered something I hadn't said aloud in years. Thank you for all you gave me. But I think I'm ready to move on now. Because this house had become a memory I couldn't live inside anymore. And I was beginning to wonder if it had always belonged more to them than to me. I still remember the day I signed the papers pen in hand, heart full of belief that I was doing the right thing. It wasn't even a question, really. When my daughter and her husband struggled to qualify for a mortgage on their own, I stepped in without hesitation. I told them the house could be put in all our names, but really I never saw it as ours. It was theirs. It was my gift. I had thought, let them build a future here. Let them plant roots where I once planted dreams. And back then it felt noble, purposeful, like passing the torch, like choosing love over possession. I imagined them fixing it up, filling it with laughter, giving the children a place to call home. I even moved into the smaller bedroom to give them more space. I told myself I didn't mind. I told myself I wanted to do it. But what I didn't understand was that the moment I handed it over quietly, legally, emotionally, I became a guest in my own home. At first it was little things. My daughter rearranged the furniture without asking. My favorite armchair ended up in the garage. The curtains I'd hand-stitched were taken down because they were too old-fashioned. They painted over the soft blue kitchen walls with something stark and modern, saying it felt cleaner. I told them it looked nice, but inside it felt like watching my memories be scrubbed away, one brush stroke at a time. Still, I said nothing, because silence is what love sounds like when you're trying not to be a burden. Over the years, I paid for more than I should have. I picked up the grocery bill when things got tight, helped with daycare, covered unexpected repairs, and each time I told myself it was family, that we don't keep score in families, that giving was what mothers do. But giving is different when you're the only one doing it. It starts to feel like erosion. One afternoon, maybe 2 years after the deed was transferred, I heard my daughter on the phone in the next room. She thought I was asleep. She was talking to a friend, casual, breezy, her voice laced with that easy condescension people save for stories about their parents. I don't remember everything she said, but I do remember this. She's still in the house, but we kind of treat it like ours now. It's just easier that way. Just easier that way. I stood in the hallway, not breathing. It wasn't the cruelty that stunned me, it was the familiarity, as if she had said it 100 times before, as if it had never occurred to her that the woman who raised her, who gave her this roof, might still need a corner of it to feel like her own. That was when the weight started to settle in my bones. Not just sadness, but a kind of heavy knowing, the kind that doesn't scream, it just sits. I realized then that I had given away more than property. I had given away authority, dignity, space, and they had taken it with a kind of blind gratitude, the kind that forgets to say thank you because it's never had to. I used to think giving them the house was the most loving thing I'd ever done, but now, sitting in my cold kitchen, I wondered if it had been the most foolish. Because a gift that costs you your place in the world isn't generosity, it's surrender. I walked through the rooms later that evening, running my fingers along the walls, like a woman tracing her past. The hallway where my daughter had taken her first steps, the stairwell where I used to sit during thunder just to make sure the kids didn't get scared, the back porch where I sipped tea every spring morning for 20 years. They were mine. Still mine in some wordless, aching way, and yet not mine. The laughter that once bounced off these walls had been replaced with quiet criticisms and digital distractions, the furniture, the layout, the decorations all curated by someone who wanted to erase the softness I'd once layered into every corner. They lived in the house like they were renting a memory they didn't care to understand. But what haunted me more than anything was this: I had taught them how to do this. I had taught them through my own behavior that I would always give in, that I would make myself smaller, that I didn't need space or recognition or care. and now they were simply continuing the story I had written with me, cast as the invisible supporting character in my own home. That night I sat in the old laundry room, lights off, the smell of fabric softener still clinging to the air. I didn't cry. I was long past tears. What I felt was older, quieter, the kind of grief that doesn't wail, it waits. And underneath that silence, something was beginning to stir. Something resolute. They may have had the deed, but they didn't have me. Not anymore. It's strange the way a house can begin to speak to you, not with words, but with echoes. That week after they left and silence returned like a second skin, I started hearing things I hadn't noticed in years, the creak of the third stair from the top, the way the hallway light flickered before settling, the soft moan of the front door when the wind leaned into it just right, sounds I once found comforting. Little quirks of a lived-in home now sounded like sighs, as if the house itself was weary, as if it missed who we used to be. I found myself wandering through each room with no purpose, touching the corners opening drawers I hadn't touched in months. In my bedroom closet was a sweater I'd knitted when my daughter was pregnant with her first child, a deep mustard color with little wooden buttons shaped like stars. I held it close, remembering how excited she was when she saw it. She'd pressed it to her cheek, said, "It smells like you, Mom." I stood there holding that sweater for nearly 10 minutes, wondering if that moment had meant more to me than to her. In the attic, I found boxes marked with my handwriting, decades of Christmas decorations, forgotten toys, old letters tied with faded ribbon. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by pieces of a life no one else seemed to remember. There were drawings from when my daughter was 5, labeled, "To Mommy," in crooked backwards letters. A yellowed school project with a note that said, "My hero is my mom because she's always there." I pressed that paper to my lips, and for a moment, I could almost hear her voice, young, innocent, full of love. And then I looked around and realized none of those memories had a place in this house anymore. I went into the guest room, once her bedroom. The walls had been painted gray, all the posters and scribbled messages gone. Her vanity was replaced with a filing cabinet. I opened the closet and found a few of my belongings shoved in a box, family albums, an embroidered pillow. I'd made some of my old cookbooks, as if I'd been slowly packed away, as if they were preparing in some quiet, practical way to forget me entirely. The final straw came when I opened the cabinet above the washing machine. There, next to the detergent, was a new set of towels, fancy, expensive, not the kind I'd ever buy. On one of them, embroidered in fine gold thread, was a monogram M and T, their initials, my daughter and her husband. And in that detail, small and easily missed, I saw everything. They had claimed the space, branded it. The house no longer whispered my name. That evening, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room wrapped in the same old shawl I'd worn for years. I looked around at the furniture they'd chosen, the art on the walls, the new rug that didn't match the hardwood I once loved. Nothing in this room reflected me anymore. Not my taste, not my history. I was a guest here, an intruder in the home I had raised them in. I thought about calling my sister, but she was gone now. I thought about writing in my journal, but I didn't have the words yet. What I did have, strangely, was clarity. Not rage, not bitterness, just truth. You can only live in a memory for so long before it becomes a museum, and museums aren't meant for the living. It wasn't that I needed grand gestures. I didn't need my name stitched into the towels. I didn't need a parade or constant praise. I just needed to feel seen. I needed to walk into a room and know that someone still remembered who I had been, what I had given. I needed to know I wasn't just the ghost who kept the water boiling. And suddenly a thought occurred to me. simple, clean, and utterly unshakable. If I disappeared, would they notice? Not immediately, I knew. They'd come around for the holidays, wonder why the roast wasn't in the oven, assume I was late or sleeping. Maybe my daughter would call once, maybe twice. But eventually, they'd unlock the door, step into the quiet, and realize I was gone. And maybe they'd be sad. But more likely they'd be surprised. Surprised that the woman who'd always been there suddenly wasn't. That the constant became absence. But I was tired of haunting this house. I wanted to live again. Somewhere. Somehow. Even if that meant starting over with less. Because less, I was beginning to realize, could still mean more. More peace. More dignity. More space to breathe. The walls were talking now. Not memories, but messages. And I was listening. 2 days later, my daughter came by. No call, no message, just the sound of her key in the door, like always still hers, though I couldn't remember the last time she asked if she should still have it. I was in the living room folding laundry, my hands working through the rhythm of towels and shirts that belonged only to me now. She walked in, holding a paper grocery bag, setting it down on the counter like a peace offering. "I brought you a few things," she said, casual, offhand, as if that was enough. Inside the bag were prepackaged meals, low-sodium soups, a box of chamomile tea. Not a single thing I asked for, not a single item I needed, but all the things someone might think an aging woman should eat, as if I were a patient, as if I'd been deemed too old to trust with my own appetite. I smiled reflexively. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt like crumbs I was sweeping into the corner. She didn't sit down, didn't take off her coat. She leaned against the counter, eyeing the kitchen like it didn't belong to her either anymore. That gave me a tiny flicker of something of hope, maybe, but it passed too fast. She asked how I'd been in that polite, impersonal way, the kind of question you ask because it's what's expected, not because you truly care to hear the answer. I told her I was fine, that the house was quiet, that I'd gone through some old photo albums. She nodded, distracted, scrolling through her phone mid-conversation. "Yeah, I've been meaning to digitize all that," she muttered. "Make a Google Drive folder or something." She didn't ask what I found. She didn't ask how I felt holding her childhood in my hands. Then came the real reason she'd dropped by. "By the way," she said, voice casual, "we were thinking, it might be good to talk about some long-term plans, just in case." "Not that anything's wrong," she added quickly, her eyes darting away. "Just being prepared." I looked at her, then really looked at her. And I saw it not worry, not love, but calculation. It was the same tone she used when comparing health insurance plans, the same detached pragmatism that made people forget they were speaking to someone with a heart and history and pride. "You've been doing so much," she continued, still not looking me in the eye. "And the house, it's just a lot. We thought maybe a smaller place would be easier, or even just something with help available, assisted." Assisted. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I'd heard everything I needed to. The groceries, the detached questions, the suggestion of help. It wasn't a visit. It was a soft survey, a gentle audit of how far gone I was, whether I could still be trusted to live on my own, whether I still deserved to. And pity has a particular weight. It's not like anger, which is sharp and hot. Pity is soft and wet, like a towel left too long in the rain. It clings. It soaks in. It tells you that they no longer see you as whole, but they'll feed you anyway. "I'll think about it," I said, folding the last towel neatly. She looked surprised, as if she'd expected me to argue. I didn't. because I wasn't interested in winning an argument I never wanted to be part of. She gave me a quick hug, perfunctory like one you give a stranger you once knew, and said she had to run. "Oh, and maybe try freezing some of those meals so they last longer," she called over her shoulder. The door clicked behind her. I stood there for a long time. Then I opened every cupboard in the kitchen, every drawer. I needed to see what still belonged to me, what hadn't been replaced, rearranged, or donated. I found my mother's old teacups behind the plastic sippy cups they used when the kids were younger. I found my recipe box shoved behind a stack of takeout menus. I found myself in the margins of my own kitchen. So I poured myself a cup of the chamomile tea just to see if it tasted like dignity. It didn't. It tasted like quiet defeat. That night I stared at the ceiling for hours. My daughter's voice echoed in my mind. Assisted, just in case. I imagined her and her husband whispering late at night, talking about retirement homes like catalog items, making decisions about my life as if I were no longer part of the discussion, just a variable to be managed. But I wasn't a spreadsheet. I wasn't a fridge magnet that needed labeling. I was still me, still the woman who raised her, taught her to tie her shoes, to wipe her tears, to build her first resume. Still the woman who held this house together with casseroles and calendar reminders. And in that moment, something inside me shifted again. The pity didn't break me. It woke me up. I don't know what it was exactly. A sound, a gesture, the way the light came in through the kitchen window the next morning. It doesn't matter now. All I know is that I was standing by the sink staring at the ceramic angel on the windowsill, and it hit me like the slow unfurling of an old truth. They don't see me anymore. Not really. Not as a woman. Not as a mother. Certainly not as the reason this house existed brick by brick, moment by moment. I was a symbol, a placeholder, a flicker of obligation they remembered around holidays and birthdays. Everything else, my needs, my stories, my thoughts, they had all faded into white noise. I think what finally made the truth impossible to ignore was how comfortable they were, assuming I'd just go along with whatever they planned. My daughter hadn't come to ask me what I wanted. She came to tell me what would be easier for them, a smaller place, help. And behind her smile was the quiet certainty that I'd agree because I always had. But I didn't feel agreeable anymore. I stood there letting the water run over a chipped plate, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel tired. I felt awake, like a fog had lifted. Like I had been underwater and my lungs had finally kicked in, screaming for breath. And with that breath came memory. I remembered who I was before I was mom, before I was grandma, before I was the one who cooks. I was a young woman with plans, with stubbornness, with a will so fierce it once terrified even my own father. I had built a life from scraps and silence. I had made a home with 2 hands and a hopeful heart. I had given everything, but I was not gone. And if they couldn't see me, I would stop waiting for them to. Later that day, I took out a small notebook from the drawer and made a list, not of groceries or chores or appointments, but of what was mine. My name was still on the checking account. I still held the insurance policies. And though I had signed over the house in a moment of misguided generosity, I knew I still had power more than they believed, and certainly more than they respected. That evening my daughter called, a quick check-in. "Did you think more about what we talked about?" she asked. Her tone was too bright, practiced. I could almost hear her husband in the background prompting her. I told her I had. "I've got a few thoughts," I said evenly. She sighed, clearly relieved. "Oh, good. I was thinking maybe we could all go tour a few places, make a day of it. There's one not far, has a community garden. You'd like that." I didn't answer right away. I let her voice echo in my ear like wind through an empty hallway. Then I said, You know I think I'll take care of it on my own. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to give up my independence. Silence. The kind of silence you only get when someone realizes they've lost control of a narrative they were sure they'd already written. Oh, she finally said, cautious now. Well, sure, of course. I just thought you might need a little help. I do, I said, but not the kind you're offering. I heard her breathing that tiny stammer that always came before she was about to get defensive. But I didn't wait for it. I told her I was fine, thanked her for the groceries, and hung up. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. I walked through the house slowly barefoot, the hardwood cool beneath me. Each room looked different now, not in design but in weight. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a museum of forgotten intention. I had tried to preserve something that no longer existed. I had tried to stay needed in a place where I was no longer wanted. And the truth, as it settled into my bones, felt bitter, but also clarifying. I wasn't the senile one. I wasn't the confused one. I was the only one still holding on to what we used to be. But I didn't need to hold it anymore. I didn't need to sit and wait for respect to return like some prodigal son. Because it wouldn't. Not here. Not in this house. It was a Wednesday, mid-morning. The sun was out, but not warm, the kind of light that looks gentle but carries no comfort. I dressed carefully, nothing flashy, but neat. A soft blouse I hadn't worn in months, navy slacks, my brown leather shoes, the ones with the worn soles but still sturdy. I even clasped on the pearl earrings my husband had given me, before we knew what disappointment would one day sound like. I took the long way to the notary's office, not out of hesitation, but because I needed to feel each block pass beneath me. Every sidewalk crack, every passing tree, every rustling leaf on the breeze felt like punctuation to the decision I'd already made in silence. When I arrived, I stepped into the quiet office, just 2 desks and a pot of fake ficus, and told the receptionist I was there for a deed reassignment. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't fumble. She offered me a seat and a cup of coffee. I declined both. I had made this appointment the day after my daughter visited. No drama, no tantrum, just a calm, clear call. Hello, I need to make a legal change to a property title. The voice on the other end had been businesslike, indifferent, but I felt something swell inside me then, like a muscle long atrophied finally remembering its strength. The notary was kind, young, maybe late 20s, but respectful, in that quiet, curious way younger people sometimes have when they meet someone who carries silence like armor. She walked me through the paperwork, asked if I had all the right documents. I did. I'd gathered them with care, each page like a brick I was lifting off my chest. When she asked me to confirm who the current deed holders were, I said their names, my daughter's, and her husband's, and there was a pause not of pain, but of finality. Then she asked who the new deed holder would be. I said my own name, just mine. There was a moment when the pen hovered above the paper, when I wondered what they would say, how they would react, whether they'd even understand what had truly changed. But then the ink touched the page, and I knew it didn't matter. Understanding wasn't required. This wasn't punishment. It was protection. I didn't want to throw anyone out. I didn't want to shame them, but I did want the choice to be mine again. The house had been wrestled from my hands through years of guilt-draped demands and smiling entitlement. Now I was taking it back not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. I needed a place in this world that still belonged to me. That wasn't borrowed. That didn't come with caveats and conditions and sideways glances. When the paperwork was done, the notary gave me a copy and smiled. If I may say, good for you. I thanked her not just for her help, but for saying what no one else had. Good for me. On the walk home, everything felt sharper. The breeze was brisker, the birdsong less delicate, more deliberate. I walked slower, not because I was tired, but because I was savoring something I hadn't felt in years, agency. When I stepped into the house, I left the front door open for a few extra seconds, just to hear the wind move through the hallway. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It didn't feel like a prison or a shrine. It felt like a choice. My choice. I made tea, not the kind she brought, but my own loose-leaf blend, strong and bitter, and dark as bark. I sipped it in the kitchen, the same spot where so many moments had bruised me, and I didn't flinch. The walls were quiet, but this time their silence felt peaceful, not punishing. Later that afternoon, I sat down with a pad of paper and began to make a list. Not of chores or errands, but of possibilities, things I'd put off, dreams I'd shelved. What would it mean to be free again, not lonely, but unburdened? They wouldn't understand when they found out. They'd call confused, maybe angry, maybe not even surprised, just indignant, like something they assumed would always be theirs had been snatched away. But I wasn't snatching. I was reclaiming. And deep down, I knew they'd be fine. They'd land on their feet, make new plans, tell themselves I was being dramatic or stubborn. That was easier than admitting they had pushed me to this. But I wasn't going to explain myself. Not this time. Because silence, when chosen, not imposed, can be power, a boundary, a final word. I folded the paperwork and placed it in the drawer where the holiday napkins used to go, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something, approval, validation, forgiveness. I already had what I needed. The sign arrived on a Thursday morning. I watched from the kitchen window as the realtor, a brisk, businesslike woman, in a burgundy blazer, hammered it into the lawn with practiced swings. The sound of metal biting into earth was sharper than I expected, final, like a bell toll. I stood there with a mug of coffee cooling in my hands, the steam rising slowly, as if reluctant to leave the same way I'd been for years. She turned, caught sight of me, and gave a short wave. I returned it quietly, one small flick of fingers above my waist. There were no trumpets, no angry knocks at the door, no tearful calls from my daughter. Not yet. Just a wooden board planted in the soil I once knelt on while helping my grandchildren dig for worms and lost toys. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about the gesture, the line drawn in the dirt, the final unspoken sentence, "You treated me like a shadow." So I disappeared on my own terms. The house didn't protest. It sat there as still as always, its windows reflecting clouds that didn't care about its past. But I swear in those quiet moments before the neighborhood noticed, I felt something shift in the walls. Not sadness, not guilt, just release. I hadn't told them, not a warning, not a whisper. They would find out the way I had found out. I was no longer needed, without ceremony, without courtesy. I didn't do it to hurt them. I did it because I was done being the doormat they wiped their guilt upon, done being a fixture, done offering warmth to those who only noticed when it was gone. The realtor walked through with her clipboard, jotting notes, clicking photos, asking the usual questions: square footage, roof age, neighborhood quirks. She asked if I wanted to stage it, bring in rented furniture, generic art, the kind of impersonal polish that made a home look like a catalog page. I said no. Let it be seen as it really was, lived in, weathered, real. Some folks want it to look fresh, she said, new, unused. I smiled, just barely. That's the problem. No one wants anything with history anymore. She gave a small nod, not understanding, but kind enough to pretend. The listing went live the next day. Photos of my kitchen, the same one I'd cried in, laughed in, aged in, were suddenly online for strangers to browse like holiday brochures. Strangers. and yet somehow that felt more honest than what my own family had become. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the inbox fill. Appointment requests, offers. The house, they said, was charming. Great bones, good light. One couple even wrote a letter about raising their children in it like I once had. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it under a coaster. I wondered if my daughter would notice the sign when she drove by, if she'd pull over, call me in a panic. I imagined the words she might use. "What are you doing? Why didn't you tell us we could have figured something out?" But those words would be too little too late. Figuring something out should have happened long before I stood in that notary's office. Love doesn't wait until its comfort is threatened. The days passed and the house began to detach from me piece by piece. I boxed up the items I wanted to keep. My old recipe cards, a few handmade decorations from when the kids were little, my late mother's brooch, the ceramic angel, of course. Everything else donated, discarded, left behind like old skin. It felt less like packing and more like peeling. Each drawer emptied felt like a breath let go. Each photo taken off the wall was a memory I thanked, then released. There was no ceremony, no nostalgia, just a strange kind of sacred silence that comes when the heart stops begging to be seen. I never told them. Even when my daughter finally called and asked why someone had mentioned the house was listed, I simply said, because it was time. She paused. I could hear the questions tumbling behind her lips, questions she hadn't earned the right to ask, but she didn't voice them. Maybe she was afraid of what my answers would be. Or maybe for the first time she realized she didn't know me anymore. "Are you okay?" she asked at last. I smiled to myself. "Yes," I said. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." She didn't press further. I could feel the wall between us grow thicker, colder. But I didn't mind. It wasn't anger. It was peace. Peace wrapped in truth. And truth I had learned didn't need to be shared to be valid. It simply had to be lived. I looked around at the hollowing rooms and felt not sadness, but freedom. The house was no longer my burden. It was no longer my proof of worth. It was simply a place, and places could be left behind. What mattered now was me. They came unannounced. A week after the sign went up early evening, still wearing work clothes, my daughter in slacks and a blazer, her husband in something smug and crisp, with his sleeves rolled up just enough to feign approachability. They didn't ring the bell, they walked in, like they still lived here, like nothing had changed, like everything hadn't. I was sitting at the dining room table, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, the kind that sits too long but is too comforting to throw out. I didn't stand when I saw them. I didn't even blink. I just said, "Close the door behind you." My daughter's face was tight, not angry yet, but bracing. "Why is there a for sale sign in the yard?" I gestured to the window. "Because the house is for sale." She blinked, without telling us. Her husband stepped forward, jaw already clenched. "You can't just sell the house out from under us." "I'm not under you," I said softly. "Not anymore." That stopped him. A flicker of confusion, then something else. Disbelief, maybe. Like a man realizing the bridge he burned was the only way back. My daughter sat down across from me. "Mom, what's going on? Why would you do this?" I stared at her, not with venom, not with sadness, just truth. Because I remembered who I am. Her brows furrowed. "You're overreacting. You've been upset since Christmas." We didn't mean anything by what was said. He was joking. You know how he is. "Yes," I said, "I know exactly how he is." The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. She looked to her husband for help, but he only crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, defensive and distant. You could have talked to us, she said finally, before making such a big decision. I set my cup down. I've talked to you for years. You just stopped listening. Her lips parted slightly, a breath caught in her throat. She didn't expect that. She expected guilt, a plea, maybe even regret, but not this calm, quiet certainty. I gave you this house, I continued, piece by piece, holiday by holiday, favor by favor. I gave, and somewhere along the way, you mistook my silence for surrender. My daughter's eyes shimmered with something anger, maybe, or fear. This isn't fair, she said. We thought. I know what you thought, I interrupted. You thought I'd stay, that I'd never push back, that I'd keep the food warm and the comments to myself. You thought I'd die here while you waited to inherit what you assumed was already yours. Her mouth dropped open slightly. Her husband stepped forward. Now, that's not. Don't, I said sharply. He froze. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to savor the moment, the power of not breaking, the power of not screaming. I had done enough of that, behind closed doors, into pillows and quiet night air. This wasn't about fury. This was about finality. This house, I said, was never meant to be my prison. She looked at the floor. We didn't mean to make you feel that way. I know you didn't mean to, but you did. And now I mean to leave. They tried to protest. They offered alternatives. We can buy you out. You don't have to do this. Let's just talk. But every word sounded like furniture being rearranged on a sinking ship. I let them speak until their pleas turned to silence, their energy dulled by the realization that I wasn't bargaining. You don't owe us anything, my daughter finally whispered, her voice smaller than I remembered. But you're still my mom. I am, I said, and I always will be. But now I'm going to be more than that again. They left not long after. No slammed doors, no shouting, just the soft sound of footsteps across a home that no longer welcomed them. I didn't walk them out. I didn't stand in the doorway and watch them disappear. I stayed at the table, hands wrapped around the cooling mug, and let the silence settle. The confrontation never exploded. It didn't need to. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply taken myself back. The apartment wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind of place you'd photograph for a catalog or invite a dozen relatives to admire. It had no sweeping staircase, no formal dining room, no antique chandelier that needed dusting once a month. It had no history etched into the walls, and that was exactly why I chose it. Just one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a window that overlooked a small city park where children sometimes shouted after pigeons and old men played chess in the afternoons. The ceilings were low, the radiator clanked in the morning, and the neighbors upstairs had a fondness for heavy boots. But it was mine, entirely mine. The first night I slept there, I kept waking up, not from fear, not from noise, but from a strange kind of lightness. Like my body didn't know how to rest without the weight of responsibility pressing down on it. I kept expecting someone to knock on the door, ask what was for dinner, tell me the water heater was acting up, leave a basket of laundry outside my room with the unspoken expectation that I'd fold it. But no one came, and slowly across that quiet night, I began to feel something I hadn't in years, peace. I set up my new space gently, slowly. A single teacup on the shelf, not 6 mismatched ones. My favorite armchair in the corner by the window, its faded cushion, finally claiming a place of honor. I didn't have to negotiate where anything went. I didn't need permission to put my mother's brooch on the dresser or hang my daughter's kindergarten drawing by the fridge. There was no one to impress, no one to please. And somehow, in that stillness, I felt more whole than I had in a long, long time. The best part was the quiet. Not the suffocating silence of the old house, but a softer, kinder hush, the kind that makes room for your thoughts. I began reading again slowly with care, like a woman meeting old friends in between the pages. I lit candles without worrying about who might be allergic. I cooked what I liked: roasted tomatoes, herbed rice, tea-soaked dates. Sometimes I ate standing at the counter, and no one judged me. I took morning walks, just around the block, no destination. I nodded at strangers, waved at dogs, stopped at the bakery, where the young man behind the counter already knew I liked my bread a little burnt. I carried flowers home, once small, clumsy tulips wrapped in brown paper, and placed them in a chipped mug by the window. They didn't match anything. They didn't have to. Sometimes I sat in silence for hours, not doing, just being, listening to the hum of my own breath, remembering what it was like to have thoughts that didn't revolve around service or survival. There was no one asking, no one needing, just me with a full fridge and a key that opened my front door. They didn't call much after the sale closed. My daughter sent a few messages. "Let us know if you need anything. Hope you're settling in." The words were soft, uncertain, careful, like someone leaving a note outside a locked door. I replied when I felt like it, not to punish her, but to remind myself that communication is a gift, not a debt. And it's funny how even in this much smaller space I felt larger. I took up room again. I spoke out loud to the television. I danced a little when a favorite song came on the radio. I rearranged the furniture twice in 1 week, simply because I could. This little apartment didn't have the weight of legacy or memory. No handprints on the wall, no creaky floorboard that reminded me of a night 20 years ago. It was blank, and in its blankness I found freedom. I didn't need a mansion. I didn't need an heirloom. I needed a place where I could be seen, even if only by myself. And slowly, day by day, I realized something remarkable: I hadn't lost my family. I had simply stopped waiting for them to return the kind of love I'd always given. And in that space between letting go and moving on, I found something even better. Peace that did not depend on anyone else. Christmas came quietly that year. No chatter, no rushing, no sounds of wrapping paper torn too quickly, no strained laughter forced around a long table. Just me, the soft ticking of my little kitchen clock, and the scent of cinnamon drifting through my modest apartment. I bought myself a small roast, just enough for one seasoned, exactly how I liked it, without compromise or commentary. I set the table for myself, not out of performance, but out of respect. 1 plate, 1 glass, 1 candle. A napkin folded with care. It wasn't grand. It wasn't festive by any popular measure, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. I dressed nicely, not to impress anyone, but to show myself that I still mattered. A soft maroon sweater, a necklace I hadn't worn in years, a spritz of perfume no one else would smell. I looked in the mirror before I sat down to eat, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't see someone waiting to be loved. I saw someone who was. There was no music playing, no children bickering, no husband carving meat with exaggerated gusto, and yet I didn't feel the ache I'd expected. There was space around me, real space, not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind you create when you stop filling your life with things that drain you. I poured myself a glass of wine, a good one, not the discounted kind I used to buy when I worried too much about what others needed. I took a long, slow sip and let the warmth settle in my chest like a second heartbeat. Outside, the city twinkled faintly through the frosted window. In the park below, I saw a man walking his dog, the leash swaying with each quiet step. A couple huddled close on a bench. Laughter from a distant apartment carried softly on the wind, muffled and unintrusive. and in that quiet I felt more connected than I had in years. I thought about my daughter, my grandchildren, even him, the son-in-law, who had once called me senile like it was a punchline. I wondered what they were doing. I hoped they were well. I hoped perhaps they missed me a little, not out of guilt, but out of memory. But I didn't ache for them. Not the way I used to. I had released that longing like a balloon over water. It had drifted away, and I had let it. I unwrapped a small gift I'd bought for myself, a journal bound in soft leather, the kind that begged to be filled slowly. I ran my fingers across the empty pages. A new beginning, not flashy, not dramatic, but real. After dinner, I sat in my armchair by the window legs, tucked beneath me, blanket drawn up to my waist. I lit one more candle, and in its glow I thought about all the versions of myself I'd carried. The mother, the wife, the hostess, the fixer, the invisible woman at the head of a table where no one really looked at her. And now just me, just a woman, whole, quiet, at peace. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of meaning in their presence. And I had been lonely for years, surrounded, yes, but never held. Now, in the soft hush of my new life, I wasn't lonely. I was alone. But I was free. And freedom, I was learning, tastes a lot like peace. Sometimes endings don't arrive with slamming doors or tearful speeches. Sometimes they come as softly as candlelight, one flicker at a time, until the room grows still, and you finally see yourself clearly in the shadows. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need a grand gesture to prove I had value. I only needed silence, mine chosen, and a space that belonged to me again. A quiet kind of justice, not loud, not cruel, just clean, just whole. People will tell you that family is everything, but I've learned that family is only sacred when it is kind, that love only matters when it listens, that respect, once lost, cannot be earned back with holiday visits and frozen meals. It must be lived, given, chosen again and again. And when it is not, we are allowed to leave. Not because we are bitter, but because we remember who we are. So I sit here now in my chair by the window, the world soft around me, and I think I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to explain my worth. I only needed to reclaim it. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. And here in this quiet, I finally hear myself again. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace.